Everyone is well aware at this point that Earth's mightiest heroes, the Avengers, are owned by Disney now. At the end of 2009, Disney had purchased Marvel, and as the MCU was building its tapestry of stories, Disney helped to produce what is arguably one of the most impactful pieces of superhero cinema, the Avengers. But before this, Disney was already in possession of another powerhouse team of superheroes with a long-standing legacy. That's right, I'm talking about Power Rangers. Disney had an interesting relationship with Power Rangers. Through the buyout of Fox in 2001, Power Rangers had landed in Disney's lap by association, and well, it never really felt like Disney cared that much for this new franchise they'd acquired. That would later be validated, as it would be some time until it was outwardly stated that Disney felt that producing and airing the show was downright embarrassing. Regardless, the seasons under Disney's ownership would enjoy a decent level of production effort and reception, and are quite commonly regarded as some of the best in the franchise's history. Some folks would say this is chalked up to Disney's distaste for it, leading to less top-down intervention, allowing the creative powers at play to do as they wished and tell the stories that they wanted to tell. In 2009, Disney would be airing their final season of Power Rangers based on Engine Sentai Go-Onger. How would Disney end up translating this zany vehicle-themed season? Well, with the gritty, edgy, post-apocalyptic mayhem known as Power Rangers RPM. Power Rangers RPM represents an interesting point in the franchise's life. With it being Disney's final season, people were a bit uncertain what this meant for the future, but in a way, this was the production team's last chance to express themselves through this particular medium, and the end result was a story that took more aggressive departures from the source material than what we had been used to. And that's something I definitely appreciate. When Power Rangers can tell a separate yet compelling story using the Sentai property, it's a testament to the creativity and execution of the development teams. Not only did it take sizable liberties from its Japanese counterpart, but it also took such a sharp turn from the typical Power Rangers tone. This entire season was an experience, and that experience is what I want to dive into today. In this video, I want to talk about what went down in this whirlwind of a season. From its hard pivot in storytelling to its handling of the merchandise, let's take a walk down memory lane together and re-explore the curious case of Power Rangers RPM. Let's get in gear. Now, while RPM was going to present us with a wildly different take on the Go-Onger concept and storyline, there's one thing that they would keep the same, to some degree at least, the toys. As always, Bandai America would produce a toy line to accompany the airing show, and while this was an exciting opportunity for Western audiences to get their hands on some Go-Onger based merch, Bandai America at this point was kind of, well, losing it. Before this, I think the last faithful toy line they did was for Mystic Force. The Mystic Force Megazord was pretty much exactly the same as the DX Magiking, with some minor differences in paint applications. In fact, I think the entire Megazord line was taken straight from those original Japanese molds. We were living it good with Mystic Force. The Mystic Morpher and staff items were ever so slightly different, but they were faithful enough to be awesome pieces in the toy line. And then Bandai America went full freak mode on their individual figures. As much flack as I'd give Bandai America, they always had some really interesting ideas when it came to America exclusive toys. But the following year, we'd get Bandai America's take on Bokenger's Daiboken, the Drive Max Megazord. This toy was kind of a sign to us that something was up, because at this point, they weren't using the original Daiboken molds. Instead, they for some reason made the scale of the Megazord bigger, but fundamentally changed up the mechanics of its overall transformation. It felt like maybe they thought bigger was better, but they didn't want to spend that much to make it as intricate as the original, so what we got instead was this oversized, kind of cheap feeling Megazord that felt a lot less premium than what I imagined its DX counterpart did. Now, I bring this up not to say that it was an entire mess from Operation Overdrive until now, but we would start to see much less dependence on the original Japanese molds in subsequent toyline adaptations, for better or for worse. Come Go-Onger's turn, we would see a significant change in the iconic gimmick they'd introduced, the Engine Souls. Adapted as engine cells, these cartridge-looking items would be inserted into the Rangers' changers to activate their powers, as well as into their engines to bring them to life. While this concept stayed very much the same in the show, their toys left much to be desired. The Engine Souls of Go-Ongers were proportionately accurate and contained lights and sounds, while the engine cells we got were these flat pieces of plastic that had no electronics whatsoever. I think this was due to two things. One was a tonal shift of the entire series, because for the engines at least, the souls would activate sound effects related to each engine's personality, and that was basically done away with in RPM. The second is the cost. I mentioned this before in my Kamen Rider adaptation video about my hesitations for a company to adapt the toy line. This is one of the main reasons why I have such a wavering faith in Western adapted toy lines. It's pretty clear that they didn't really care much about the quality of what was being put out on the market. What mattered most was profits, and what better way to maximize their profit than by significantly simplifying the toys, therefore reducing the cost. Well, actually a better way is just to make good toys, but this sentiment began to echo louder and louder leading into this season, and the resulting toys would bear no exception. And while we would get some wonky, cheaper adaptations of specific Go-Onger items that paled in comparison to their originals, we would at least get all of the Megazords to be able to create the Ultrazord formation, even though I was never able to actually buy them all because I never saw the Mock Megazord or the Paleomax Megazords on store shelves. But speaking of the Paleomax Megazord, I will give credit where it's due with the Paleomax Rangers. Bandai America designed and released corresponding Ranger figures for each of the Paleomax Zords. This was actually pretty awesome. We'd known of Power Rangers' abilities to create new Rangers, with the first one being Lightspeed's Titanium Ranger, and the latest at that time being Jungle Fury's Spirit Rangers. The Paleomax Rangers were given original forms and concepts that were quite distinct from the original cast of Rangers, and honestly, whoever designed these really understood the concept. While the Spirit Rangers of Jungle Fury more or less resembled the core team's master modes, the Paleomax Rangers pretty much had their own style and aesthetic, pretty similar to how distinct Gold and Silver were from the core 5. The Paleomax Rangers were undoubtedly something special in RPM, and while never having existed in the show, they fondly exist in our hearts. I feel like I'm talking as if the RPM toy line was an absolute disaster. It wasn't. It wasn't entirely what I expected, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't have fun with it. I owned the Morphers, both the Cell Shift and Rev Morphers. I actually owned the Go-Onger counterpart to the Rev Morpher, so I was able to make real-time comparisons. I also owned 2 of the Megazords, the High Octane and the Valve Max Megazord. I even owned their take on the Mantan gun, the Nitro Blaster, which suffered from some aggressive changes but also implemented a very silly lightsaber mechanic for the sword extension. While I wasn't really blown away by the toy line, it more or less served its purpose as a placeholder for the Western toy line adaptation. Although I'll never forget that they decided to let this slip past QC. I absolutely will never forget. With this one aspect of Go-Onger having been adapted, what was left to develop was the story. I'm sure we've all thought about Power Rangers in a darker, grittier setting. Some people actually turned those thoughts into reality, some would hit, and some would miss. But who would have thought that for an apocalyptic season, Power Rangers would choose this as their basis? Granted, they probably didn't have much choice. This was the last season they'd be working on, and since Go-Onger was next up to bat, they did what they could. And boy, did they do what they could. For context, let's do a quick review of Engine Sentai Go-Onger. The Go-Onger story follows 5 individuals who team up with animal vehicle hybrids called engines from a parallel world called Machine World. The engines are pursuing the evil Gaiark who made their way to Earth with the intent to use their destructive powers to create an ideal paradise. Through their combined forces, the engines and Go-Ongers make their stand against the Gaiark in order to defend Earth from their encroaching pollution. This concept sounds simple enough. It's a fun and whimsical story that actually ties in some important environmental messaging, and it has a colorful cast to support it. Power Rangers RPM decides to take a different approach to their story. In the story of RPM, a computer virus has taken over the world and is using a massive robot army to bring civilization as we know it to its knees. Amidst the chaos and destruction, the domed city of Corinth is both a safe haven for refugees as well as humanity's last stand against the virus. The genius Dr. K develops Ranger operator technology in order to grant specific individuals the power to defend humanity from this looming and impending threat. So that in itself tells you a lot of what you need to know. It's kind of funny because if you didn't really know what the story was about and you saw screenshots of RPM, you might think it's like one of those scenes when your custom character is in a really important cutscene. The tone is vastly different. It essentially de-emphasizes the racing aspects of Go-Onger and takes it in an entirely new direction. In addition to the core story being so vastly different, there were some other parts about RPM that I found to be thoroughly enjoyable. In RPM's story, a bulk of it centers around the Black Ranger operator, Dillon. Dillon is one of the first characters we're introduced to, and we get the idea that he has some mysterious circumstances. There are, of course, 2 revelations that play a crucial part in his story, one of which is that he is actually part machine. The other is that one of the recurring antagonists of the Rangers, Tenaya 7, is Dillon's long-lost sister. I thought that the focus on Dillon was really interesting. It by no means diminished the other Rangers at all. Each of the team members had their chance to showcase their motivations as civilians and their growth as Rangers. But I think starting things off from Dillon's side and having them continue to route through him at its core helped diversify the storytelling. Red Rangers, while I love them, usually get most of the focus. From character development to a buttload of power-ups, Reds are kind of like the favorite child of the team, getting pampered more times than none. But having Black as the center of it and distributing the cast development differently felt like a pretty refreshing change of pace. Not to mention the quality of the drama was pretty good as well. Remember that iconic line where Flynn says, "I'm Scottish" to Tenaya 7? Absolutely wonderful. Speaking of that moment, Flynn's iconic quip appeared in an episode that was pretty widely enjoyed by audiences. In episode 10, titled Ranger Blue, the team is confronting Dr. K about different aspects of their ranger suits and armaments. They ask about the big googly eyes on the Zords, and Dr. K clarifies that they are optical scanning sensors used for the rangers' displays while in the cockpit. Regarding the explosions that occur after they morph, Dr. K clarifies that the explosions are a result of residual energy that go into the morph and have to exit somehow. Then, when confronted about the catchphrase they utilize to morph, Dr. K explains that the catchphrase serves as vocal recognition and a security measure to ensure safe usage of the Rangers' powers. For the first time, Power Rangers was acknowledging the small yet important details that made the show iconic, while at the same time silly and campy. The wacky designs, the explosive morphs, the self-declarative roll call, this was a really clever way for them to incorporate this self-awareness, because I don't think it ever really gets brought up in any other season. You could argue that Dino Thunder's Lost and Found in Translation episode tackled a similar topic, but it was more so about the regional differences rather than the nuts and bolts of the franchise overall. I was also really impressed with the comment about the eyes on the Zords. That was probably one of my biggest concerns. How on earth were they going to adapt the Go-Onger engines? Even before we knew that RPM was going to take place in this kind of setting, I had a strong feeling that Power Rangers was not really going to like the sentient Zord idea and would have to circumvent that in some way, shape, or form. And they did so in such a clever way. I think there's a lot of value in this being the only time those eyes are discussed, and also how quickly it's resolved as well. It sort of serves to quell not just the Rangers, but also us as an audience by saying, hey, it's not a big deal, and here's the perfect explanation for it. It's incredibly smart and it handles itself very well. While the tones of Go-Onger and RPM are vastly different, Power Rangers found a way to make it work in a way that felt grounded, self-aware, and believable. Power Rangers RPM had a lot of things going for it. Sure, it had a very questionably executed toy line with some blatant pieces of disrespect, but it also shook things up by telling a dynamic and adventurous story. Within the context of Disney's history of owning Power Rangers, RPM seemed to be the result of an apocalypse itself, and would be the creative team's last hurrah before they would be parting ways with the franchise, and you can't help but feel like this story was treated with a deep love and passion for the property. Building out a story like this to be integrated into one of the most quirky Sentai seasons must have been an incredibly difficult task, but I'm glad they did it this way. RPM was truly an unforgettable experience, and it is commonly and quite deservingly heralded as one of the top Power Ranger seasons in history. So that was my experience with what some of us thought would be the end of Power Rangers. Now, obviously, my view on it is a bit of a combination of my general analytical and critical eye, along with my heartwarming nostalgic memories from growing up with it as a kid. How was your Power Rangers RPM experience? Did you like it, love it, or maybe it wasn't your thing? Let me know. Thanks as always for tuning in. I'll be back with more fun Toku topics to Toku talk about. See you all next time.